I brought you on because, like I said, I think you've had a chance really with almost 80 now podcasts to interview a spectrum of people that I would say that are challenging the prevailing wisdom. It's kind of like what the Gone Rogue model is kind of about, just just having a different perspective, being open about it. Could you talk to us a little bit about your background, how you got into it, and what started you on this journey?
Yeah, so I have a background in electrical engineering, and I ended up doing a lot of work in the computer software world. So up until about 2004 or so, I just was off in my own world and believing whatever scientists said. I just tended to kind of believe it. But then in 2005, there was this announcement that the ivory-billed woodpecker had been rediscovered. And there was a peer-reviewed paper with 17 authors, and it got huge amounts of publicity. And as a bird watcher, I started looking into the evidence, and I was shocked to find that the evidence they had for this rediscovery was just incredibly flimsy. They had a blurry video, and they had a 6-pixel picture that was 2 black pixels on top and then 2 whites in the middle and then 2 blacks in the bottom. And that was supposed to be an ivory bill. And that part in particular was astounding, because even if you look at the picture in my background here, if you were to blow that up, you would find quite a few ivory bills in the woods behind me, because it's just a very common pattern you find if you have a high resolution picture and you blow it up enough. So in my blog, I started tearing apart this evidence, and all sorts of other people started joining me, and we kind of got that one debunked. But someone then sent me an email saying, as you look at this controversy, you should look at the global warming controversy, because a lot of the same factors apply here. There's a ton of groupthink, and the evidence is flimsy. And if you really dig into it, you'll find out that it's not what you think it is. So that's how I got into it.
And then having a master's degree in electrical engineering, that must mean you're more of an analytical thinker, or you try to be. Is that kind of how it also, as you start looking at some of the information, it might have made you want to quantify things and see if you could validate some of these theories? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love to just look at the evidence for myself. And in the global warming case, I like to tell people, you don't at all have to be an expert. You can just look at graphs of things like crop yields and polar bear populations. And there's all these different things you can check out easily yourself. You don't have to learn all the details of how atmospheric physics works. You can just sanity check stuff on your own. And so I did do a lot of that.
And then we've got there's a list of issues that are going on right now. Obviously, there's the reasons financially between the carbon credits business that's going on, and this seems to be funded though from a while. Like, this has been a long-term project. Is that also what you see? And then with the funding being almost incentivized, that anything with a climate change name on it, you would get addressed first before any other projects. Could you talk about that a little bit?
It's gone on a long time. I don't know if you're aware, if you've dug into it much, but there was a global cooling scare in the 1970s, because the Earth really did cool, it looks like, from the 1940s to the 1970s. And there were a lot of articles and magazine articles and even papers saying that the Earth is cooling and humans are the reason, and it's bad. And because of the cooling, we're going to get more droughts and more storms and more floods. And it's amazing. It's just the reverse of what we're seeing now. Now they're saying the Earth is warming because of humans, and all the same stuff is supposed to happen because of warming. So anyway, around in the 1980s, it flipped from a global cooling scare to a global warming scare. And there was James Hansen gave some Senate testimony in June of 1988. As far as I know, that was kind of the time when it really flipped, and the global warming scare started in earnest right around then. So.
And then for the layman, could you explain a little bit about the IPCC, how it started and how has this kind of been created, and who's backing it, or who's involved in it?
I can't tell you in detail about how it got started. A few of my guests have talked about it, but I can't tell you exactly how it got started. There was a guy named Maurice Strong that helped get it started. And I think that started around that same time, maybe late 80s or so. But it's an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And I think it's very important to note the government part of that it's governments working on it. And what I do know a lot more about is how the IPCC has worked since it got started. That there's a person named Donna Laframboise who's talked about who works on the IPCC. And it's sold to us as like 4,000 of the top scientists in the world are working on it. But that's far from the truth. It's more of a political thing, and countries might not nominate the person who knows most about the climate. They might nominate the person who better represents their interests or something. And there's a lot of people who have worked on the IPCC who are just maybe graduate students, and they kind of admittedly don't know much about the subject that they're supposed to be writing about. So you look at the IPCC from the outside, and it's supposed to be the greatest thing ever and the gold standard. But if you look at it more from the inside, there's a lot of problems with it. And then one big thing, people don't really read the whole IPCC report because it's so thick. Hardly anybody reads the whole thing. There's a summary for policymakers that's short enough that people can read it. And that is it's approved in a closed door session. They don't even have it webcast. They don't allow reporters in there. You don't know what's going on in the room as they're negotiating the science. The whole idea that a bunch of people, maybe bureaucrats, are in a room and they're negotiating line by line about what the science is. That's just not how science works at all. But that's how the IPCC works. So I wouldn't throw out everything the IPCC says, but I wouldn't blindly trust anything they say either.
The government part of it in the
Yes, yeah.
that kind of little red flag. And it was interesting because when I started going into, I mean, I've had my own issues with other parts of science that I delved into, and then I started researching CO2 for other sorts of treatments, for healing, actually, for different parts of the body, how it functions, how it's limited science that you were taught when I went to get my organic chemistry and biochemistry. They never really talked about the benefits of CO2 in the body and how it functions and how it drives a lot of our function and our cell function and oxygen absorption. I start looking into how they were using CO2 for therapies in Europe and in other, Eastern European countries, and the benefits. And then I start doing, okay, let me look at the CO2 also as a trace gas, mind you, in the atmosphere. Somebody was telling me about some of their debates, and then to check out the equations at the IPCC and doing the math myself. I mind you, I could be doing them very incorrectly, but then I started to find it's common that even with their expectations, they're talking about a 1 degree, maybe more, maybe 1.5 to 2 this century increase. With the amount of repercussions, negative repercussions from creating a colder world or the problems of the heat, it seems to be exponentially swayed one way, this perception. Now, this is...
Yeah, you touched on something there. This whole basic idea that the Earth is too hot right now, that the warming since 1850 has been bad, that fundamental idea is very clearly wrong. That in 1850, we were exiting the Little Ice Age. But if you look at historical references as to what happened in the Little Ice Age, those were bad times to be alive. That crop yields were lower. During the depths of the Little Ice Age, people were starving. And in Europe, supposedly they burned 50,000 people as witches. And part of the reason was it was a Little Ice Age and they had to do something to, again, they thought the bad weather must be caused by people that they don't like. So they actually went and killed witches, and it worked because it warmed up eventually and the crop yields came back. But yeah, but anyway, the whole idea that we want the Earth to go back to the temperature in 1850, we don't. The warming since then has been beneficial, clearly. Yeah.
Then with CO2, as I was studying it in my own personal lives, so I found the health benefits, but I've been involved in indoor horticulture and investing in businesses that grow indoors. And one of the biggest staples of a successful indoor greenhouse is supplementing CO2.
Yeah.
You don't have 400 parts per million in your, if you have a greenhouse, you're at 1,200. And and you're talking about the reproduction growth, 40, 50, 60% increase in the production of your vegetation. That's dramatic. Why is there no focus on this? I mean, this is something that every farmer understands, and it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing that that's the story we're being sold, that 420 ppm CO2 is too much. But Patrick Moore has done a good job of stressing that generally in the last, maybe for millions of years, in general, the Earth's CO2 level has been going down. If it gets down around 180 or so, then the plants generally can't reproduce, and life on Earth is in huge trouble if CO2 gets too low. So we're way too close to CO2 being too low than too high. And in the past, it looks like from some measurements, I think maybe it was 4,000 parts per million in the past. And so the whole idea of 420 ppm is too much. It's just not. It's fine. A lot of additional CO2 would be good, as you say. I think Patrick said that maybe 1,200 ppm CO2 might be optimal for life on Earth, or even more, because the plants just love it. And then, of course, all life on Earth depends on that. So that would be great for life on Earth. What else was I going to say? Oh, we're exhaling about 40,000 ppm CO2 right now. So, and the human body is mostly made of carbon. So the whole idea that we need to fight carbon, or that carbon or carbon dioxide is pollution, it's just not.
I also found it funny that there's been, it's called carbogen. I don't know if you heard of it before, but it's a mixture of atmosphere that you would breathe in. That's 5% CO2 and 95% oxygen. And anesthesiologists use it, fire departments used it, and they've been using it since the 50s and 60s. And what it does is it helps bring more oxygen to the body. It has to do with the Bohr effect. But it was just an interesting concept, and they're doing this now. This is something that you have in the medical community. That's a common knowledge. But I look back at it, and it's only now, after 25 years of being in my own independent thinking here and looking at other ways to look at stuff, that carbon was anything other than an exhale gas. It was anything other than just a toxic gas, not an exhale gas, a toxic gas that we need to get rid of. But instead, like you were saying, it has so many functions in our life. And if we were to actually go to certain lower levels, we have a chance of actually eliminating a lot of life. CO2 is the basis of a lot of our life that we are, our vegetation. So I was going back into I think you talked about really well the idea of groupthink and how kind of dangerous it is, and we get caught up in it. But I think it's even harder to think that the scientists, these guys that are spend so much time in the lab rooms, are getting caught up in that same sort of groupthink.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think that's maybe the biggest factor in how humanity has gone so wrong on this issue is groupthink. It was even in the smaller case of the ivory-billed woodpecker. There was just tons of people at Cornell and various places. They 100% believed that the ivory bill had been rediscovered, and they weren't trying to scam people when they were saying, "Hey, it's been rediscovered." They actually believed it. They didn't go and check it for themselves. They just trusted other people. And I think the same thing is happening in the global warming world. I think a lot of people have dedicated their lives to this issue, and they truly believe they're helping to save humanity. And they think that, yeah, it's so important to do this. Otherwise, the weather's going to get so bad, et cetera. They're just believing this because they think other people have already proved it. The number of people who believe it but have actually looked at the data for themselves has to be minuscule, I believe.
Yeah, and I think I think they try to make it. There is some complexity to this issue, and there's a lot of variables, but I think they also try to increase the delusion of complexity.
Yes.
Where it's unfathomable that you'll ever figure this out. It's impossible for us to really get an equation that could give us more predictability or more accurate information. Is that safe to assume?
Yeah, I agree. Earth's climate is just unbelievably complex. I think it's more complex than almost all of us think. I don't think we're ever going to understand it in my lifetime. I don't know when we ever will understand it. But what we can understand is that CO2 isn't the climate control knob. We can understand that the Earth isn't too hot. But then if they're saying, okay, unless you can tell me how Earth's climate works, we're just going to assume CO2 is the driver of climate change. That's not how it works. I don't know how Earth's climate works. There's a lot of people on my podcast that put forth their various explanations, and I think they're probably all partly right, but it's not one thing. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the key point. So we know how complex it is, but there are certain things, certain factors, certain equations we can even look at when we're talking about a trace element in the atmosphere that has, we're at what 400 parts per million, so it's like 0.04% or maybe 0.05% of the atmosphere. That doesn't make a lot of sense in my mind for being a greenhouse, creating greenhouse effects. Compared to the overall amount of nitrogen and oxygen that's in the atmosphere. Does that make sense? I mean, it's just simple. I'm not an advanced, scientist in a laboratory here, but simple math in my mind says that a trace element shouldn't have that much effect in that arena.
Yeah, I think you're right. Interesting, though, if you would have asked me 1 year ago, I would have said that it's a done deal, that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And for sure, if we double it, we're going to get at least 1 degree centigrade warming or something. And now after listening to more people on my podcast, I don't even know about that. I think if we double it from here, I don't know what that number is, but it might not even be measurable. I don't know if that's a measurable amount of warming. If we left everything the same, doubled CO2, I'm not sure yet that we could measure that, the warming.
And I do find that we have selective studies. Like you said, we talked about how the funding gets created a certain way, and then we spend so much money on space exploration, but we don't travel very much in the oceans. And some of my favorite research was by Robert Ballard. I don't know if you heard of him.
I've heard of him. Yeah.
He does a lot of submarine dives and was one of the first ones to explore some of the ridges. And he's on the water finding for the first time thermal vents with 650 degrees and coming out from the bottom of the ocean. Where is that in the calculations of the IPCC? How could we even add that into the factor that could be warming the ocean? Obviously, I think the sun is the main factor. Obviously, just from simple, just my own assumption and observations, but we have yet to look at a lot of we just found them. We just found these thermal vents in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And several of my podcast guests have talked about that we're not accounting for the volcanic warming, all that magma, and like you talked about, all that heat coming from the core. And then some people are saying that the sun may have an effect on how much of that heat comes out because the Earth's crust is very thin. And then the amount of pull from the sun is varying. And as the sun's pulling on the crust a little bit, it's enough to change volcanic activity. And volcanic activity looks to be seasonal. If you look at volcanic activity over that seems to be seasonal. And I don't know what's causing that, but I think there's just so many different things to be thinking about in terms of what's really causing the heat. So it's not CO2.
And the gentleman you had on, I think his name is James McGuinn.
Yeah.
Great. I loved his interview. I got lost in his stuff a little bit, but his idea though that we're delusional, I think is the best analysis to understand mankind. If you just start, and it's our history. If we were to be really objective about ourselves and our past, we've carried a lot of delusion, and Absolutely. I think we're almost caught up in that. Are you starting to see a shift though? I think I even said it in my email to you. I feel, and maybe it's just me being hopeful, that we're kind of at a tipping point because of just some of the information. And like I said, maybe I'm just being too hopeful. But what have you seen, and what has your response been?
I think I'm feeling a shift. I could be delusional too, but I've been doing this for like 15 years or more now, kind of daily. I sit down and I spend hours and hours on the average day just reading everything I can about what's going on about the climate change controversy. And I read enormous amounts of stuff that's coming from the other side. I would say I read more of their stuff than I read of our stuff. And at the beginning, I kind of felt alone. There was a sparse number of people that were pushing back. And now it seems like there are way more people. I love the fact that Twitter has opened up, but constantly on Twitter, I'm finding new people that I've never heard of before that have just producing all sorts of brilliant stuff. They're talking in detail about here's why this climate change claim is not true. I'm seeing a lot of that. So that gives me a lot of hope. If they're doing this podcast, I'm meeting a lot of new people too that I hadn't heard of before that have ended up being on my podcast, that they've been off maybe in Germany or other countries, sort of on their own, not really talking to too many other people, but writing their own papers about it and writing their own blogs and everything. So anyway, I am seeing a shift. And I do think that in the last maybe couple of years, because of other things that have happened that I'm not going to mention because I don't want to get your channel taken off of YouTube.
Appreciate it. No,
yeah.
I get you.
But because of these other things that have happened, I think people are much less likely to just trust the man. And I think they're more willing to say, well, maybe stuff they're telling us is not right, or maybe people have other incentives for telling us stuff. So I think people are questioning the narratives in general more now.
Yeah, I think, through the pain a little bit, kind of changes you, forces you to be a little open-minded.
Yeah.
And I think it's the benefit of going through all this stuff. And the last, like I said, I've had conversations, about some of these ideas that weren't mainstream, say 5-10 years ago, and I either had stuff removed or things were taken down, or it would get dismantled to the point where it felt frustrating for me to pursue it in an outward way, where I would just internalize it, buy books, read, and then test theory, talk to people. It's all in private. But just even watching your podcast, it was inspiring to see just a different mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had something. One thing that made me really happy is recently the BBC themselves said you should not listen to Tony from the internet. I just love the fact that they said Tony. They're talking about Tony Heller. Tony Heller's making that much of an impression now that the BBC is telling people not to listen to him. I love that. His YouTube channel, I think, has close to 120,000 subscribers. He's just killing it out there. I don't know if you've seen his videos, but he constantly produces brilliant 6-minute videos saying, here's what Google says today and here's why it's wrong. And he's really good at looking up old newspaper articles and stuff, showing how bad the weather was in the past. And I love his work there because nobody can go back and fudge those data, fudge the storm, the articles about storms. They can't fudge those away. They're out there, and no matter what, we can go back and find those and find out how bad the storms were, for example, in the past.
And with that, I'd like to stay on that one just for a second. Tom, you've done some research into this. Has there been anything to show us that our storms, cyclones, hurricanes have been getting worse up over the last 200 years?
Nope. I've looked at it extremely careful. I've spent, I don't know, maybe thousands of hours over time looking at all this stuff. There's no signal in any of this stuff. If you're alarmed that storms or droughts, floods, etc., if you're alarmed about anything, I've looked very, very hard. I can't find any data that anything is getting worse, because it's not. Yeah, it's just not.
And it's not because we didn't have data. We have data, and there were more severe hurricanes. I mean, we're talking about, I think, one of the worst ones where they were losing hundreds of thousands of people in like Bangladesh. Or, I mean, this is maybe a couple hundred years ago. I was looking at some of your stats, and we have the data. It's not like we don't. We're not saying we've had 200 years of reporting on this, so we should be able to make assumptions saying we aren't getting worse.
Yeah, so I think if you're 16 years old and you have never read anything, and your teacher tells us, oh no, there was a hurricane that killed 10 people. I mean, it's really terrible that a hurricane killed 10 people, but your assumption that it didn't do that in the past is wrong, because as you said, there's a list of the worst cyclone death tolls in history, and there's a lot of them that killed over 100,000 people a long time ago. And of course, that's when a lot less people lived on Earth. But there's various reasons for that. I'm sure that we have better warnings, and we're better able to get people out of harm's way, and that's part of the reason why we have less of a death toll. But I think the number of people killed by bad weather is down by something like a factor of 50 since about 100 years ago. It's way down. Yeah. So the whole idea that there's these kids at these climate marches holding up signs saying that you will die of old age, but I will die of climate change. I think that's just sad. I see that sign quite a bit, that they actually believe that. And you hear stories of kids that don't want to study because why study? I don't have a future anyway. I think it's just evil that we're brainwashing kids to believe stuff like that, because they do have a future. Yeah.
We're losing the benefit of science where you're supposed to have debate. I mean, we really are. And I've got 2 kids, and they're one's in high school and one's in elementary, and they both are getting the same one-way thinking that it's, we're on a time clock before everything's over. There's nothing we could do. We better just listen to the leaders of the science community, and it's getting bad. I mean, it's kind of depressing when you start hearing some of almost scaring the kids at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do have one slight success story on the local level. I think it might work for all of us to push back on the local level. It was like about 3 years ago, I got wind that there was going to be this climate cult presentation at my local high school. So I found out about it. I found out what they were going to say. But I asked for equal time. I said, if you're going to show this, why don't let me show my presentation? And it turns out that neither one of us got to speak, which is fine. But I take that as a victory.
Wow,
but I think they should hear both sides. They shouldn't just hear one side. And
Isn't that
yeah,
the way to do it? Isn't that how we're
yeah,
supposed to base science is
absolutely.
on argument? And like the
Yeah.
definition of argument is to make clear. So we're trying to make information and science and facts, or if they facts, our information as clear as possible so people can make their own
Yeah.
decision.
Hmm.
But that is
I
a beautiful
think
story.
I think it would have been great. There was this thing that where they were going to have a red team and a blue team under Trump. There was going to be the blue team that said, okay, there's the climate crisis, blah, blah, blah. But they were going to have a separate red team, possibly led by Will Happer, that was going to present the other side. It never quite happened. I guess there was pushback on the inside somehow. But in some future presidency, if that were to happen, that would be fantastic. I think it would be great.
Yeah, I don't think that they really want that that argument, the conversation piece to take hold, because right now
Yeah.
it would catch fire. Because I do think that they are very intelligent and they do have think tanks that
Yeah.
use parameters of thinking, certain ways that we're allowed to talk about things. I mean, I think I'll give them credit. It's intelligent the way they phrase the question. These half truths, like, you don't believe in climate change? Oh,
Right.
that's a beautiful question. I mean, it's such like it involves you almost committing to either you're one way or the other, no gray. And of course, you can see there's climate change
Absolutely
happening all the time.
Mhm.
But the fact that like the idea we don't call it, climate crisis. I like that actually a little bit better. Obviously, it's a more clarifying.
Yeah.
But then again, we still need to get into a better question where it's what is driving climate crises or potential climate crises,
Mhm.
and then stepping back and being more objective. But I think the way that they've created the way we talk about the subject even is masterful. Okay, I'll give the opposing side their due. They're very good on their word games. It's amazing.
This whole scare is getting really long in the tooth, though. Some of my guests have talked about how long Lysenkoism lasted. I think that might have lasted a little over 30 years. I'm not sure that whole thing, but it just can't go on forever. And a lot of my guests have said that just this whole lack of bad weather, if we just keep going on and on without the hurricanes getting worse long enough, at some point, even the kids of today, as they grow up, are going to find out that all those scare stories were not true. And of course, we're going to get some individual bad hurricanes. And yes, we're going to get terrible droughts, et cetera, but it's not going to be worse than the stuff we've already seen in the past.
And I think a lot of this, like we're talking about that narrative, it takes a certain amount of the energy from the community to focus on, there actually are real issues with the environment and people with just say, I mean, I'll put it out there, the United States military is one of the worst polluters there would ever been. And then big corporations around the world. I'm not just putting them on blast and they support what they do. And, I've got a nonprofit for vets and I love them, but I have to be real. I have to be very open about what we have good things we do. We got to be open with the bad things we do here. And, just recently, I mean, I was born and raised California. They just found out, I think it's 2021, they're dumping 27,000 barrels of DDT in the ocean. And the only reason why they found this out 40, 50 years later is because 1 in 5 sea lions are dying of cancer.
Really?
I mean, these are things that we have these kids, we could be putting their energy, because we have limited amount to use, on those kind of problems. And just our toxic farming, the fact that we don't have regenerative farming, that we use pesticides in large amounts, and our food is not accepted in any other countries except for, the United States. I think once again, it's intelligent on their part to keep us in this parameter of thinking and talking, because we're not going to focus on these other problems over here.
I think they don't want to focus on any sort of local pollution problems, because they really want this global thing. They want to be able to transfer wealth from rich countries to poor countries. And if you're just talking about some local pollution problem, they don't have that luxury of the wealth transfer. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
No, I think you're onto them, because if you also look at just introduction into the cars, into electric cars, and then our mining for our cell phones, and the fact that you start seeing what they're doing in these countries for cobalt mining, for lithium, and they're having children miners. And we couldn't even get in there. It was only in the last couple of years that a few people start being able to get videos of what's really going on. And we think we're so environmentally friendly, but then you really see what it takes to get electric vehicles made and on the road. And the reason, I'll even put this out there, that my granddad worked at Rocketdyne for a long time, and he worked on an electric car back in the day. And he had a prototype, and they were trying to get it out and do things like that. And it got shut down. The car had to be taken away, and it was the end of it. But these technologies that we could be focusing on, it feels like there is an agenda to keep certain sciences and information from being mainstream. And I think what you're doing is incredible. And I think it's very helpful, because I think the delusion of complexity in a lot of these issues is what keeps people from even trying it. They'd rather just stick to their Netflix show or YouTube shows, thinking that somebody else got it. But I think we have to switch that way of thinking, that paradigm. We can figure this stuff out. We can have our own opinions, and there's a power in that. We're all creators. We can create, and work together. And leaving it to other people we've kind of see where we are right now and potential problems that are occurring now by letting people kind of run things.
One thing that makes me happy kind of is it's easy enough for at least I've only been podcasting for like 8 months or something. I think it would, maybe you've been doing it a lot longer than me, but I think just this technology we have now is making it a lot easier for us to communicate with each other even than it was 5 years ago. So that makes me happy.
I do. I think that's why I kept saying the tipping point, because I feel that we have the technology on our side, and this information has been around for a long time of competing sciences, but it'd be much easier to shut up scientists when you don't have open Twitter, mind you. That helped a lot. That's really has, and I think even YouTube has gotten friendlier with content. Like I said, we've had issues in the past, just say 5 years ago, about posting anything that might be, against the grain when it came to climate change. Other things were acceptable, but climate change was just, you don't step in that arena unless you're a PhD and part of the IPCC.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or something, it seems like skeptical scientists, to get their word out, they had to get a paper in through the gatekeepers, they had to get a peer-reviewed paper in. But now they don't have to do that as much. They can get the word out, even if there are gatekeepers in front of them in the peer-reviewed area, they can still get the word out other ways. So I'm loving that. One thing I wanted to mention when you were talking about green energy is I just want to throw it in there about Greta Thunberg. Just now, she's been protesting wind power. I don't know if you heard about that just this week.
No, I've not.
Oh, yeah, because they were putting up wind turbines. Somehow it was interfering with reindeer herding someplace in Europe. So she got hauled away protesting wind turbines. I thought that was just delicious. I love seeing that because they're talking about, it disturbs the animals and it disturbs the rights of the people who own these animals. So then I'm thinking, okay, how about the people in Iowa or everywhere else? Is it disturbing their animals or not? Or I guess, or disturbing the people? So that's a good development there.
Yeah, I think her getting over 18, it feels like people could start actually making fun of her a little bit. Before that, people are just like, oh, she's a little kid. Don't say nothing.
I think that was part of it. I think she was deliberately rolled out because she could speak and you couldn't push back because being mean to a kid if you push back.
Oh yeah, no, it was super smart on their part. I thought it was great gameplay. That's really they're masterful. The opposing team, I really give them credit. Like they're gonna keep swinging for the fences, and it's been working for a long time. I think it's only been now that they're starting to see the tide turning, a little bit, and that's why they have to announce on BBC. Hey,
don't.
Oh no, that's great.
No, I don't know what's. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going to happen to the Michael Manns and the Catherine Hayhoes of the world. People have completely devoted their entire life to it. I think they just have to cling to this for the rest of their lives. I don't think they can just wake up one day and say, okay, Trump was right and there is no climate crisis. And I devoted my entire life to this thing that was a fraud. I think they just have to cling to it. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, well, I think they have to cling all the way to the edge. And then even when it does make that shift, and they're just going to walk away because they've lost all credibility.
Yeah, I know.
And you got people like Judith Curry. I mean, these are people that have devoted their life into researching and trying to create their own truth. And then once they put them out there, they get ridiculed. It's going to be a transition. I believe eventually that's going to. You go ahead.
Oh, well, there's like Andy Revkin formerly of the New York Times. He wrote about climate change for a long time. I see him as a guy who's eventually going to say, okay, I never really fully bought into it. And look at all the weasel words I used back in my articles when I was writing about this in 2005. I put in some may and coulds and whatever. I think he might explain some of it away like that. I think a lot of people generally will say, I never fully believed in it. And, I smelled a rat even back then. I think we're going to hear some of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're still going to try to keep their grant money coming in, so they'll transition to something. There's always a way, and like you said, I think we're as a people we're kind of kind. Like we are. We'll be a little bit generous. Oh yeah, they made a mistake. We all make mistakes.
Yeah,
and I think good.
I think the scientists are going to say the press overblew what we said. I think the press is going to say I just reported what the scientists told me. I think there's going to be finger pointing both ways on that front too.
Their damage control is amazing. I gotta tell you, every time I think they're in trouble, they're getting in trouble. They have a think tank working around the clock, or some beautifully scripted monologue comes out, and you're like, wow, I know the truth, and I'm still questioning my own truth. You're like,
even on that issue that we can't talk about that has happened recently, I think there's a lot of that, gaslighting of we didn't say what you remember that we said and all that. It's hard to scrub all of that, all the quotes off the internet, though. That's a tough task.
It really is, and I think how that plays out will also kind of give us an idea how the climate change is going to play out.
Yeah, I think so.
But you could already see how they're building up the conversation of, live and let live. It's okay. People make mistakes, and we'll get past it.
Yes, good point. That's coming with the climate thing too.
Yeah, and I think that's what they're going to do. They're going to do a lot of apologies. Like I said, I still don't think I don't. I understand we're dealing with some dark people or some people that
Yeah.
are definitely they don't want to lose their control. I don't say call them dark.
Yeah.
They're good at what they do. They're
Yeah.
good at they want to keep that control. They got more tricks up their sleeve.
Yeah.
I don't think for a second they're walking away yet. They're just they're in the room right now or something. They're figuring some more ideas
Yeah.
out for the future. So
So I really hope the climate hysteria dies off before even more evil stuff is done. Because I don't know if you saw, I had a guy named Jasper Machogu on from Kenya, just a very smart
mm-mm.
guy. He's just talking about how evil it is for do-gooders here sitting in the West to block fossil energy for people who desperately need it in Africa. They think they're doing a good thing, like I'm helping preventing droughts in Africa, but they're really preventing hospitals from running on reliable power in Africa. It's just a terrible thing. So I really hope that we can end that hysteria and get the people the power that they need soon. We'll see what happens.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that is a forgotten about it, how we're, on the kind of high and mighty side where we have the ability to start using other electrical sources and creating electricity other ways.
Yeah.
Where in these other countries that are, third world, they call them, you're talking about shutting down hospitals. You're talking about shutting down markets and
Yep.
functions
So
of life.
Martin Durkin, he's a Brit filmmaker. He was on my podcast too. He made a great film called The Great Global Warming Swindle quite a while back. And he actually went to Africa and he filmed in a clinic. They were trying to run an African clinic on solar panels. So they could either run their refrigerator or their lights, but not both at the same time because they didn't have enough power to run both of them. So who in America wants to go to a clinic where you can have either the fridge on or the lights on? Like nobody cares, I guess, about that clinic because it's far from their house. But to deny those people the power to run their clinic and have a real clinic, it's just straight up evil. But I thought he did a good job of exposing that. But I think it's probably still happening as we speak over there right now.
Who's the guest you said who came on your show?
His name is Martin Durkin.
Martin Durkin.
He's a great Brit filmmaker. Yeah, I really enjoyed that podcast episode. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the part of changing our infrastructure on energy we overlook, and it seems so simple for us because we don't suffer very much out here.
Yeah, we don't suffer much, but we might start suffering like in with the freeze in Texas a couple of years ago when I think part of the problem was when they lost their power and some people actually died. I think. Because I think they were trying to cut it too close and not having enough real power running. They're hoping that wind would take them through this the time when they need lots of power, but it didn't because it got really cold and I believe it wasn't windy and they didn't have enough power. I think blackouts are coming to the U.S. as we continue to shut down real power stations and dream that we're going to just run everything using solar panels and wind turbines. I think blackouts are coming. I think they might be coming to Europe too. So.
It doesn't make you think that it's a concerted effort at this point. It's just too many things in a row. If I'm looking at it's like a chess game, there's too much motion in a concerted way when we start eliminating energy sources before we're ready.
Yes.
Have you talked to anybody? I haven't gotten into the nuclear scientists. I've got a whole bunch of people that want me to interview some of these guys who are talking about how some of it might be overdone on how toxic nuclear energy is in certain capacities, and how certain amount of radiation, different kinds of radiation, isn't what they're saying it is. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that because I'm going to have a guy named Ed Calabrese. He's going to be on my podcast sometime soon, and he may be one of the biggest experts on that very subject, talking about how there's this LNT. It's a linear thing where if 100 units of radiation is bad for you, then 1 unit of radiation must be 100th as bad for you as that. They just think it's a linear thing. He says, no, if you look at it, it's not necessarily linear. It might be more like a J shape, and a small amount of radiation might be better for you than no radiation. Pretty amazing. But the whole linear thing that there's almost for sure some sort of baseline amount of radiation that's not harmful, because if you eat a banana, there's some radiation in your banana. It's not harming you. So yeah, I'm interested to have him on. He's going to talk in great detail about this. But he's talking about there are some people who live, I don't know where it is. There are places where the background level of radiation is like a factor of 100 more in some places than in others on Earth. And people are living just fine where there's background radiation that's way higher than where you and I are right now. So maybe the fear of radiation is overblown. I think it is.
And I think that just that conversation, it doesn't go with the the parameters of keeping us into this nice climate crisis, and that there is no other alternatives. So the idea that those could be possible, or that could be a truth, it's not going to see media light. They're not going to be pushing much in front of the people.
Yeah. But it is amazing though that a lot of people who say that CO2 threatens to kill us all, but yet they're anti-nuclear too. Because if you really think the CO2 is going to kill us, nuclear seems to be the way to go right now, based on the choices we have. But a lot of them will have none of that.
Well, then I look at I look at what big money does, and you've got, actuators who are letting people buy properties on beaches, and insurance, mortgage actuators, insurance actuators. They're all looking at these numbers. They're not thinking that these water lines are going up. They're not thinking that these homes on the ocean, on the beachfront, are going to be lost in 20, 30 years. They're still there. And then you got Bill Gates, who's heavily invested in the last 10 years in two things, but for farmland for his carbon credit, but he also got involved into nuclear technology. And you're like, well, that's interesting. He don't make many mistakes. Like, he doesn't invest in bad ideas. He knows where things are going. Right. So it's got to be to the point where I think, we're going to be going back to some nuclear technology, but it's going to be his. It's going to, or there, I'm going to call it there, that group of people.
You make a great point, though, that people are not really worried about sea level rise. People are actually buying properties on the beach. And officially, the amount of sea level rise since about 1870 is, do you know this number at all? I have. It's supposed to be about 8 inches since 1870. So, so that's something. And people say, hey, look, it's risen since 1870. It must be our fault. But how much did seas rise in the last 20 centuries before that? Last 200 centuries before that is 2 feet per century, 400 total feet. And it certainly wasn't a linear 2 feet per century. It varied a lot. But over the last 200 centuries, it's up 400 feet. So, and people were around, people were living on Earth 200 centuries ago in the whole scheme of things. It wasn't that long ago. But yeah, the sea rises, it's not necessarily our fault. I would guess maybe humans have some small, maybe not even a measurable amount of blame for that 8 inches of sea level rise. But I think tons of it has to be natural.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the point of selective data. You just selectively pick what works for you, and you can get really creative.
You can. You absolutely can. Yeah, they can spin every little thing as being caused by climate change, and it's caused by us, and it's bad. Just about anything that you don't like is caused by us, and somehow through climate change, it's bad. Like, they're just happy to say whenever it snows too much someplace, that's caused by humans because we warm the water, and so there was more water vapor, so that caused more snow. I see that explanation all the time. They're just happy to say that. And then when it doesn't snow enough, they're happy to say for some other reason that's also bad, and that was also caused by us because it was too warm to snow or something. It's just whatever.
Tom, have you heard of, or maybe you've even interviewed, his name's Professor Ian Clark from Ottawa?
I've heard of him. He might have been on the Great Global Warming Swindle. It sounds
I think he was. He was. He had the theory, and it was doing the research on CO2 is a lagging indicator for temperature change, and by using ice core data, I think it was 800 years. And he had a lot of a lot of testing on that theory. And for me, that concept makes more sense. If you're looking at a trace element and being CO2 is created, like I said, in smaller amounts as a whole, and then these ice, this is not debatable for most scientists that we can kind of lock in a part of the past in these, going through these ice, using them as these ice samples, anyways.
I'm glad you brought that up, because just before we started talking here, I'm editing a podcast where a guy talks in great detail about this very issue. His name is Marcus Ott. He's from Germany. And he most of his podcast talks about this actual issue of the lag, where it looks like it's not CO2 that's driving temperature. It looks like it's the warming of the oceans that's driving CO2, because there's 50 times as much CO2 in the oceans as in the air. And when the air warms up, then when the ocean warms up, it can't quite hold as much CO2. So then that CO2 goes into the air. So as the oceans warm slightly, then CO2 in the air goes up. So I think he's probably right. I think we've got cause and effect mixed around. We're spending like $40 trillion based on this idea that it's the other way around. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And I think that for me, it's just simple. It's simple math. It just seems like if you have a big number over here that could potentially hold way much more CO2, say we're talking about the oceans here, and you have the sun as a heat source, and you've got CO2 at 0.04% of your atmosphere, and we're creating just a portion of that. It's not 0.04%, and whatever it's increasing every year. It's not all humankind that is increasing that. We have other elements, volcanic activities, and all sorts of stuff that are creating CO2. The fact that is groupthink, is it that dangerous? That's where my mind goes. Like, how are we not questioning sooner? And I remind you, for a long time, I felt the same way, where I was just kind of taking the science for what it was. I didn't think that there's too many scientists involved for this to be anything but what it was. The math had to be what it was.
Yeah. So I was a believer. Like I said, as of 2005, I was thinking, okay, somebody's proved this. I didn't take the time to check it out. So I think there's probably a lot of people like me who is right now, they haven't taken time to check it out. But oftentimes people will say to me, oh, why are you bothering with looking at all this data and putting all this stuff you do? Because data doesn't sway anybody. I just don't agree, because data swayed me. Like Anthony
Absolutely.
Watts. Anthony Watts has spent enormous amounts of time doing his website. What's up with that? He was a believer. Tony Heller was a believer. Tons of people who are working daily to debunk it started out as a believer. So I think it's totally worth it for us to spread the word, and people, anybody that we can get to look at the data is quite likely, if they actually look at the data, they're quite likely to turn skeptical. I don't know how you can look at all this data with any sort of open mind and still think that CO2 is the climate control now. I don't know.
I think
Yeah.
what you're saying though is, people have to be open to challenging the prevailing
Yes.
wisdom.
Yeah.
They have to be uncomfortable, to be able to debate, and even themselves. Like I said, I had to challenge myself when I start looking at this information, when I start trying
Yeah.
to use the equations of
Yeah.
IPCC. And
one thing I like to say is that when I was a kid, I used to imagine what the future would be like way out to 2020. And this future is way more stupid than I thought it would be. Way more stupid.
you couldn't think of it that way. I
No.
don't think in your childhood mind you're too
No way.
hopeful.
Absolutely.
And we would go backwards, and it seems like we have. We've been able, and now I think the wildest part now is that we're kind of caught in this either we we're at a fork in the road where we have to decide: are we going to use technology for our benefit, or are we going to use technology for our control? And we have to. There's self-responsibility in one way. You have to self-reflect, and you have to be able to look and analyze and be objective. But if we're afraid to do that, I feel like this system is perfect for control. So I think what we're doing right now is we're trying to create, we're allowing people the opportunity, like, hey, here's some information. You have to be more analytical about how you look at things. And we're giving them an opportunity, I think, because before, though, there wasn't even an opportunity for people to even look at these things analytically, because all the information they were given was one-sided and pushed in an agenda type way.
So you talk about using technology for control, and I think that brings up, I think we're right on the cusp of them implementing some sort of central bank digital currency. So then they've got control of your money, and if you've eaten too much meat, because meat causes bad weather, then you can only buy so much meat, and you certainly can't buy more than your allotment of gas for your car, and you can't fly, et cetera. I think the Bill Gates of the world would love to have that sort of control over us to prevent bad weather. They got to control us. It's for our own good. So I am really worried that that's going to get implemented, the whole central bank digital currency thing.
Yeah, and I think it plays into a lot of the business model that goes on. Let's say with how they're trying to get farming down. Regenerative farming has no funding. They really do not try to push that. And then I've also tried to help a few small businesses that were trying to get into hemp farming. And I don't know if you know about hemp a little bit, but hemp, they make hempcrete out of it. So people make houses out of it, and it's a CO2. It's a carbon negative. So if it fits into their model, which I don't even think that benefits is what it is anymore, but it fits in all their parameters. But except it's cheap, and it heals the soil, and it takes no pesticides, and it's just really productive. And you can have you can make 4 crops a year, and you don't have to use much fertilizer on the soil. It actually heals the soil. So these kind of things that you would think that they can. We used to grow hemp. I mean, the money was made from hemp back in the 1800s. All of the forefathers of the United States grew hemp. So these are things that, if they were trying to solve problems, which I think they're trying to create problems, a Hegelian dialectic type situation where they create the problems and have the solutions for us. We could be pursuing other avenues. And like I said, the plastics. I mean, look, I do think we could diversify for some oil. We could be using hemp plastics and other types of plastic that might be not as bad and not leaching into our water and stuff. But like I said, I don't think that unless it fits the group's model, whoever's kind of trying to run things out there, they're not going to invest in it, and they control the money. The bankers still control them. They control the currency, and so they control what projects get pushed and pursued. And there is a big challenge ahead of us.
So speaking of crackdown on farming, are you following what's been happening in Europe about the crackdown on nitrous oxide, where they're just pushing farmers off their land, just using the climate scam as an excuse to take away their land? I think it's horrible. They're talking about doing that in Canada. Maybe they'd probably love to do it in the U.S. later. There's that. And then kind of related is this ESG thing that happened I think it was in Sri Lanka, where they were trying to get the best ESG score they could. So they wanted to grow all their crops organically, and it completely failed. And I believe there was rioting in the streets. Just a terrible thing that if you're not going to use modern fertilizer, you're not going to get the same crop yields that you expected. So again, that was some sort of, I don't know if that was a global warming thing or just this whole ESG thing where we're going to score people based on stuff other than actual results, I think is another problem.
Well, I think it falls into a gameplay, a consistent gameplay to get a consistent result where they get more control. And you control the food, you control energy sources, you control the people. And it's sad to say where we're at that point right now, But I was really had my heart was breaking for like the last 20 years. They were talking about the amount of suicides that farmers in India were having because they were getting caught up just doing GMO crops. And then they would raise the prices on them of their pesticides, and they would raise the prices on their GMO seeds every year. And then between 5 or 6 years of growing this GMO crop, they lost everything. And that was, their main purpose is taking care of their family. And then the toxicity levels, they were finding so many of these farmers that were just ending their lives because they found no resolution, and everybody was having the same problem. They were going to lose everything to the bank. And then so now these big corporations come in and they can buy the property for cheap and disrupt what they've had as generational farming, and there's no repercussions. If anything, it's just we have a stock market that I consider the stock market pretty much the biggest parasite we have, one of the biggest parasites we have on mankind.
So yet another thing, another way that the climate scam is impacting farmers involves my dad's farming area just north of here in Minnesota, which they are offering 10 times the going rate for cropland rent to put up solar panels. So if someone's going to grow corn there, it might be, I don't know, just call it $100. I don't know what the number is, but whatever that number is, to put solar panels there every year, it's 10 times that. So that whole idea of taking farmland in Minnesota where solar panels don't really work anywhere anyway. And because of subsidies, they can afford to pay these huge prices to basically convert good farmland into ridiculous solar panel land. That makes me sad. But it sounds like that local people have fought it off, and it's not going to happen in this particular case. But anyway, subsidizing solar panels in Minnesota to cover good farmland, completely insane.
That's absolutely insane. And, and the value of that land is in farming. And the idea that we could be creating energy other ways. Yeah. But once again, I think it also creates more control. But I think it also works with this whole climate. I think the carbon credit business model is about to get very interesting. I think that they've been building this up for a long time. And when they start turning up the prices on how much they get paid for carbon credits, that's when we're going to see things change. When farmers start getting paid more to leave the land alone and just to grow trees, that's when we're going to really start to see, okay, well, they're making so much money from the government tax credit or from other corporations paying them for their carbon tax credit. You're going to see a lot less farming, and we're already having issues with that. So I think we're at the cusp of, we need to get this information out, let people understand, and we need to start taking care of our farmers. We keep walking away of how important they are to us in society. They're one of the main sources of life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the more we forget about them, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and our future.
I'm a huge fan of farmers. I mean, I grew up on a farm, a dairy farm, so I have experience working on a farm. I'm a pro farmer. I was just going to say that if we spent $40 trillion on wind turbines and solar panels and all this stuff, I think all that money, it's not just like there's just a small climate benefit. I think there's no measurable climate benefit. We could do all this stuff, and by 2050, we cannot measure any benefit. It might even make the climate worse, because if we cool the climate by 0.001 degrees, I think that probably makes the climate worse anyway. So it's basically all pain and no gain to do this.
Yeah. And one theory I was going to talk to you about before we're done, is the cosmic rays creating clouds, cloud covers having a relationship to sun rays and our overall global temperature. Have you heard anything about that? That was just another theory somebody was talking to me about. Have you heard anything?
I did. I had Henrik Svensmark was on my podcast talking in great detail about that.
Okay.
So yeah, I've heard about it. He makes a good case. There's another guy he works with called Nir Shaviv, who also lays out the case. I've seen him make like a 25-minute presentation about it. Very compelling, that through a very complex mechanism, as the Earth goes through some of the spiral arms of our galaxy, that there's more or less cosmic rays that are being formed. And just a very small change in the amount of cloudiness on Earth could explain a huge percentage of the fluctuations we're seeing in temperature, because clouds are so important in influencing the temperature. Yeah.
Right. And this will be a risky subject to talk about, but have you heard anything about them trying to change the weather patterns? I mean, I know we all know that they do some sort of spraying on occasion here and there, but they keep talking about it more progressively or aggressively about putting aluminum, other things that can reflect the sun. Have you had any scientists that have willing to talk about that? Because I know that's a dangerous subject, and people really just kind of put your tinfoil hat and say they'll never do that. They're not going to do something like that. Have you heard anything about that, or
on my
about it?
On my podcast, that's just been barely mentioned, so I wouldn't say very much. But I think there has been some articles in the mainstream media about, we got to start looking at this because the Earth's getting too warm, and we got to start spraying stuff up there. We have to somehow reflect the sunlight. So I think people are investigating it. And there is this HAARP program. I think it's HAARP, something like that. People have mentioned it. It's an actual website. I think that's I don't even know what they're doing, but people are checking into it. I don't know how much is actually being done in real life. I thought I heard that China is actually doing some. Like I thought they were trying to influence the weather during the Beijing Olympics, I think, to maybe prevent rain or something. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah,
I think they've done
I've
something.
heard
I
of
don't know.
it. Absolutely. Well, the thing
Yeah.
is, yeah, well, Tom, I got I got into mental health outreach about 15 years ago for veterans and first responders, and I've got my own nonprofit that I kind of fund and I spend time with. And with these last 10, 15 years of working with these veterans, the older ones, they have some of the best theories about what's going on in the world that you'll ever hear. They're the most mind blowing, wild stories. You know, some you just laugh at. And but they were talking about the technologies that we've used to manipulate the weather, like in Vietnam. Like that's, they say that's undebatable, where they were using, they were able to make storm clouds and cloud busting, things like that in Vietnam when they were having issues over there.
Really? Okay.
But they are aggressively they've been telling me that that the HARP program is something they've spent a lot of money on, and there's a lot of ships that have technology and very powerful weapons if they're ever used. I say that this is just, you know, stories from these are ex-veterans. Some are still active duty, but most of them, and they don't say everything, but they definitely say that they spend a lot of time and effort developing different sorts of microwave frequency and HARP type devices. So I'm interested to see that kind of information come out, but I understand that military technology kind of drives science technology a little bit. You know, we spend so much money on the military side that it seems like if it benefits military, we'll get some benefit on the side on our side. But
yeah,
I would see it also benefit them for not telling us if they did have it. Also,
don't they say that nowadays the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth is like 6 months? I've heard that. So I don't know.
Nowadays, it seems like it doesn't take long for you know. I think the independent journalism is really starting to kick in, you know, and the people that are starting to just they're tired of being fed, you know, half truths, you know. And I looked up the definition of half truths yesterday, and I was just, you know, it really means a lie. It really it's the opposite, you know. It's or a lie with an objection, you know, with a objective, you know, with a mission. And I think that we are getting tired of it because we're starting to see the effects.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I think the people you've had on your podcast are those people. You know, they are been tired of being lied to, and the guy was just talking about James McGuinn about his idea on water and the phase it's in between gaseous and not, and at room temperature and boiling, and you're like, it's a head scratcher, but darn, it kind of makes sense. I got to talk to him. I'm like, that was great.
If you like his, you should listen to my Gerald Pollack podcast also. He's supposed to be a very well-respected scientist, and he's got some ideas that are out there. There's a fourth phase of water, I think called easy water.
Yes, I saw. I have it on my list to watch now because
okay.
And then I was going to, what do you recommend? You've done so many of them. If you were, well, I guess 2 questions out of your podcast. What would the 5 you'd recommend? And then anything that you would recommend to the layman? Like I said, mind you, I think a lot of what I try and do is I try to make short bursts of information available for people in like, you know, edible bites, you know, some that they can consume because of our attention span being kind of lower. Anything that you recommend for the younger generation for them to start questioning things, books, anything that you've read, or maybe just getting more involved with professors or questioning?
Yeah, I should have a better answer for this prepared, but I don't. But there is a book by Mark Morano called A Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. I think that is very well done. Yeah. There is an app called the Inconvenient App, I believe, by Gregory Wrightstone. That actually is a good one in terms of it boils things down to very small little bites. It tells you about polar bears and maybe crop yields, all sorts of things. So that's a good app you can have on your phone and look up stuff really quick. As far as my podcast, I'm just looking at which ones were the most popular. There's one by Leonard Den Boer. It's The Sun, Not Us. I think that's a fabulous one. There's one by Michael Kelly that actually doesn't talk about global warming, but it talks about what engineering-wise, what would we need to convert all of our cars to electric cars? That's very interesting. That just the amount of cobalt I think we need that we mine in the world today, I think we'd have to use almost all of it just in the UK to convert their cars to electric cars. It's something like that. That just it's just a pipe dream that we're going to convert everything to electric and then just see if that improves the weather. So that's one. I do like also last one maybe I'll mention is my year-end podcast where I put clips. It's kind of a highlight clips podcast where little highlights from everybody that I had in 2022. I would recommend that. Yeah, but I'd recommend following me on Twitter also.
Okay. Yeah. If they got to check out your show on YouTube, I'll definitely get you linked on that. Yeah. And then you're on Twitter and you're pretty active on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm very active on Twitter. And actually, if you really want to get into all the details, what's up with that, Anthony Watts' site is a great place to keep track of what's happening. Also, Climate Depot by Mark Morano.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that sounds great. No, I really appreciate your time here, Tom. This was great. And I'll just stop right here.
Okay.
Oh, actually, one last question for you, Tom. Have you heard anything about the hydrogen? I'm sorry, I should have ended
Oh,
on my time. I told you it would, but I
oh,
got you. So I'm going to ask you.
not a problem.
Uh,
Okay.
the anything on hydrogen and hydrogen gas, because you see, I mean, I've had it a couple times. My military guys always bug me about it, that they've been able to have hydrogen almost work congruently with gas engines, and that they've created technology. Porsche has it right now on some of their vehicles where hydrogen is almost a replacement for gas. Obviously, they made it sound like it was dangerous, and then some of the scientists back in the 80s. I mean, there's YouTube videos, you can find them. They were driving around Corvettes with hydrogen gas he created himself. In his Corvette, put 4 hydrogen tanks in the back, and they would drive around, and water is supposed to come out the back, not changing much. Have you heard anything about that? That type of technology, though, is disruptive. And I know that they even changed laws and consider people terrorists if you disrupt the financial markets. I mean, these are laws that were changed. I think it was after the 9/11 or something like that. But that kind of, and it makes sense too. If you're to disrupt that much money, you're causing problems for the economy. You could cause real damages. Have you heard anything about those kind of technologies at all? Or
I've heard about it, but I bet you know more about it than I do. But I do remember reading about it. It might have been in the 80s or something, where it seemed like it was coming right then. Yeah, but maybe this time it's really is coming. But for some reason, there's like a 40-year lag. I don't know what happened since the 80s, between the 80s and now.
Yeah, I know Porsche is working on a car right now currently. They even have a race car with it. And I know in Japan and Saudi Arabia, they have hydrogen stations, and they have hydrogen cars that they're working on. Toyota's already created one. Toyota is actually one of the most aggressive in that technology, but they were not allowed to ship any cars here to the States, and they were not pursuing anything. I don't know if they weren't releasing patents or what was going on, but I get it. If they were ever to create a hydrogen fuel source for cars, that destroys the EV game a lot, or it has potential for, and potentially the oil gas game. So, it's kind of a twofold. You're pissing off both of the biggest financial institutions' incentives right now.
So it sounds like a conspiracy theory again, but I do think there's, well, I'm talking about EVs though, that pushing us into EVs. I think that's a step into making us get on a public transport. I don't think they really want everybody driving an EV. I think they might want people to drive an EV, so then they have control, and they can say, okay, you can only drive a certain number of miles. It is. Yep. It's the type of thing that I would have dismissed 2 years ago, but now I don't dismiss it anymore.
And actually, the way you just said it, it made that's probably the clearest way I've heard somebody talk about it with that kind of clarity, is that if you're looking for what's the long-term goal of this, what's the long-term effect of this, is not everybody can have electric vehicles, and then so you can limit who does have them, and then once you get back to mass transit, which look at you, Tom, just breaking down the system.
Okay, good for
great stuff. Oh no, that was it. That was absolutely wonderful.
I enjoyed this.